Frank said, "Oh, well, this guy is nuts." So he hired me. The spontaneous energy of the performance caught Frank's attention. He saw not only a skilled keyboardist, but also an artist willing to break boundaries. That was exactly what Frank always sought in his collaborators. George, then in his early 30s, was classically trained at the San Francisco Conservatory, proficient in classical music, but inexperienced in the free-spirited atmosphere of rock and fusion. Frank's invitation marked a turning point, drawing him into an entirely different realm of experimentation. Their first rehearsal took place in Frank's Los Angeles studio. George stepped in with a score full of strange markings, fragmented melodies, shifting rhythms, patterns that defied logic. He looked up and said, "I can't do this." Frank replied with a short line that set the challenge. "Oh, you mean it's beneath you?" The room fell silent, then reopened into a genuine trial of will. From that moment, George understood that Frank didn't care whether he played the notes perfectly. What mattered was whether he dared to step outside his comfort zone. The band then included Ian Underwood, Jeff Simmons, Aninslee Dunner, Mark Volman, and Howard Kalin. They were all seasoned musicians, accustomed to unpredictable arrangements and intense working sessions. Frank had just split from the Mothers and was redefining his sound after the album Hot Rats, which had laid the foundation for modern jazz fusion. In this new lineup, George was the only outsider from a classical background. He described himself as a music student walking into the laboratory of a mad scientist. The fateful encounter in Los Angeles was only the beginning of a series of trials George Duke never anticipated. The years of chaos. When George Duke officially joined the Mothers, he entered a working environment unlike anything he had ever known. Frank Zappa did not lead the band like a conventional conductor. He worked like a sound engineer, observing, experimenting, taking notes, and constantly pushing his musicians beyond their limits. George recalled, "He would find your strongest talents and make you use them." Frank didn't want musicians who merely played the right notes. He wanted them to become instruments for discovering what had never existed. George realized that in this world, everyone was part of an experiment. Rehearsals were relentless, lasting for hours. Frank demanded absolute precision while encouraging improvisation. He didn't care about perfection in the classical sense. He wanted to find life within the errors. The years 1970-1972 were the most intense, the most creative. George took part in recording Chunga's Revenge, an album that carried on the free spirit of Hot Rats, but with stronger performance energy. Frank oversaw every stage from instrument selection and sound layering to the handling of echo in the studio. Each take was captured on analog tape, and he checked every small detail. For George, it was no longer just a recording session, but a process of research. After Chunga's Revenge, Frank expanded his ambitions into film. The Project 200 Motel was born in that context. Both the movie and the album of the same name became a large-scale experiment combining cinema theater and orchestral music. George played a crucial role in the soundtrack, performing keyboards while assisting with arrangements. The filming took place with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, featuring Ringo Starr and Keith Moon in comic roles. Frank coordinated more than 100 people in a single shooting day. No one could understand how he maintained order amid such chaos. George later said, "Music felt chaotic, carefully orchestrated." That sentence perfectly described Frank's method. Everything seemed random, but was actually tightly controlled. Frank built a framework, then set the musicians free inside it. If something went off, he didn't correct it. He noted it down and treated it as the seed of a new idea. For George, it was the first time he saw someone use mistakes as creative tools. The atmosphere within the band was always tense. Frank required everyone to master their part, but no one ever knew where a piece would lead. Each performance was a new version. George said a day with Zappa was never the same as the next. That unpredictability both frightened and fascinated the musicians. For George, it was the greatest school of his life. Frank taught through action, not theory. When he wanted a passage to sound dangerous, he didn't explain. He simply told George, "Make it sound like it's about to explode." Sometimes George didn't grasp it immediately, but when Frank nodded, he knew he had it right. Over time, George learned to read the leader's mind while developing sharper, faster musical reflexes than ever before. In the studio, Frank was always the last to leave. He would listen to the entire recording again, noting every small flaw, then deciding whether to fix or keep it depending on feeling. George noticed that Frank didn't just compose. He edited like a film director, shaping each sonic layer to create tension, rhythm, and release. For him, music was drama, and every detail served a larger emotional arc. Though Frank maintained control over everything, he allowed each member to express themselves. His leadership was based not on command but on challenge. Everyone had to prove they were flexible enough to survive within that organized chaos. George gradually understood that it was inside the disorder where true creativity emerged. After 2 years, George temporarily left the band. The relentless pace had exhausted many. Some members quit earlier. A few stayed for new projects. George said, "I never really left the lessons Frank gave me." Soon after, he returned, no longer the cautious student. As the first notes of Overnight Sensation began to play, their relationship entered a new phase. Two creative minds working on the same frequency. The unexpected collaboration. George Duke returned just as Frank Zappa reached the peak of his creative power. After a brief hiatus, he stepped back into a familiar world that had completely transformed. Frank had just completed a series of large-scale experimental projects and now wanted to focus on sound that was more structured, performative, and deeply personal. George's return carried great meaning. Frank no longer needed just a musician. He needed a collaborator capable of helping him shape a new musical language. They began working on Overnight Sensation and later Apostrophe. These were not only commercial successes, but also marked a turning point in how Frank perceived the role of his collaborators. George recalled in an interview, "Frank produced a demo for me, then said he wanted to use one track on his album and would write lyrics for it. I said, 'You paid for it. Go ahead.'" The song Uncle Remus was born from that moment. It was one of Frank's rare pieces, with clear social overtones addressing inequality and personal freedom. George created the music, Frank wrote the lyrics. They exchanged ideas briefly, with no long discussions about philosophy. This collaboration marked a period when Frank completely moved away from conventional rock patterns. George said Frank worked like he was painting with sound. On stage, their partnership became the centerpiece of the band. Frank encouraged George to sing even though he had never considered himself a vocalist. George recalled, "Sing wasn't something I trained for, but Frank pushed me." At first, he sang just a few lines to demonstrate melodies. Frank heard something unusual in that raw but natural voice and asked him to sing an entire segment of the show. From then on, George's voice became another instrument in Frank's sonic palette, a human element woven between the metallic structures of electronic instruments. The performances in Hollywood and Detroit showcased their creative relationship most vividly. Each night the set list changed. Sometimes they stretched Cosmic Debris to 15 minutes. Other times they cut Inca Roads in half to test a new idea. Frank taught that music doesn't have to be neat to be beautiful. That sentence became George's lifelong principle. He realized that beauty in music lies not in tidiness, but in truth of feeling. Frank taught him how to master chaos, while George learned to turn that chaos into emotion. Their differences, one meticulous, one intuitive, created a perfect balance. In the studio, Frank maintained strict discipline. He demanded multiple takes of each passage, selecting and assembling fragments like a film editor. George followed patiently, understanding that every detail served a purpose. During improvisations, Frank granted complete freedom, sometimes even urging, "Break it up a bit." That controlled freedom set their band apart from the rest of the rock world at the time. Mutual respect between the two grew stronger. George no longer saw himself as a student. He was allowed to propose, to argue, even to experiment with his own arrangements. Frank was hard to please, but he always acknowledged when George's ideas worked. During some rehearsals, Frank let him lead the band while he observed from the side. George saw that as the greatest proof of trust. When Uncle Reese was released, it received widespread acclaim. The song became